Okay. Uh, Hello, everybody. We're already in week 4, so we're coming down to the end zone. I'm very happy about that. That's always good news, right? You guys are almost done. You did as far as I'm concerned, from what I've graded so far, from what I can see, very good. You did a good job, and that's, the most important thing. Yeah, it's good stuff. So not, we have a couple of things coming up. But and I just finished with the school working on a new class, putting a new class together, a money banking class. Designed it for the class. I do that in different places. Like as I told you, I'm an older guy and I'm in my 60s, so I'm not that old, but old enough, right? I'm mid 60s, 66 to be exact. And so I help. I've been doing a lot of that with different schools, and I'm kind of tell you, I'm getting better at it, obviously, because I'm doing enough of it. But basically, when you work at certain schools, you put the class together. Like I teach at Rutgers University, which is our state university here in New Jersey, and I also teach for the City of New York system. They have some wonderful systems. It's called the City Universities of New York. There's like I'm gonna guess about 12 or 14 of them. So I teach from one of the campuses that's close to me in Staten Island. But so over there, you put your own classes together. But a little different than putting an online class together. I've been trained. I've taken classes with online, and it's a little different because you have to design discussions. You have to design certain assessments that would work for the online or the adult learner. Because usually online translates to adult learner, not always, but sometimes. So yeah, so that kind of thing, and even locally, there's a couple of small schools here. I've designed stats classes for them, so I teach statistics. Well, at any rate, just a little bit about me. Not that it's important, but I appreciate the work you guys have been doing, and I know that you've been on top of it, and hopefully the McGraw Hill system is working for you. I think it's a good system, and hopefully it's a good system for everybody. I see the feedback. I did get some feedback that people felt that the classes were a little later. They would rather have had them earlier. I can only, I grade on Mondays and Tuesdays. So and Wednesday's a busy day for me. So that's why I tried to move it to Thursday. Try to move it in spots where, you got the whole weekend to at least chew on it. And if you could see, I don't really apply, except for the end of the class, I don't apply a lot of late penalties because again, I feel that, you're an adult learner and you may need the extra time, but I do want people to stay on track. All right. So having said all of that, that was one comment. I don't know what the other comment was. I did get a second comment. I think it was, I don't remember. But at any rate, let's look at this. We're in module 4. So let me share my screen. I'm not sensitive. I'm a big boy. I feel that, people, you want feedback because that's how you want feedback, right? You want to know what's working, what's not working. I've been fortunate since I've been teaching, and now it's going over 14 years since I left finance, that I've gotten very great reception. I mean, thank the good Lord. It's really worked out. But you want to keep up on that. You want to keep that good feeling out there. So this week is internal controls and risk assessment. And if you want to look at the activities, we're going to talk about internal control system, risk assessment. And risk assessment is basically, when at its core, it's going to be to make sure that is what's happening in your firm is consistent with keeping your investors and even your employees, everybody safe. Because let's face it, if you have um, a situation where there's because you haven't been watching the risks in your firm, there could be malfeasance, or people can cheat, or overspending of money, or leakage. You're not just affecting your shareholders. That's bad enough because those are the people who gave you the money to get started. You're also affecting your employees who are out there trying to do the right thing, and then they find out one day they lose their jobs, like the Enron thing, right? So you don't want that either. But at any rate, let's take a look at this video together.
All right, in this video, I want to talk about internal controls. And internal controls from a financial reporting perspective are really just policies and procedures that are put in place within a company to ensure that what is reported to investors is what actually happened. And internal controls got a lot of attention around the year 2000. And that's because during this time, we had some huge accounting scandals. Investors were being told one thing, and another thing was actually going on within a company. And that led to some huge scandals that brought down some of the biggest companies in the world. For example, Enron was one of the biggest energy companies in the world. And in 2001, its share price went from $85 a share to 30 cents a share after it was revealed that the company had billions of dollars in losses that were not reported on the financial statements. So investors weren't being told about these losses. And when they found out, you can see this share price tanked and Enron collapsed. And when Enron collapsed, there was a lot of collateral damage. It had impacts on other companies as well. For example, Enron's auditor, Arthur Anderson, they went down as well when this scandal was discovered. Another scandal that happened around the same time, WorldCom, when it reported $11 billion accounting fraud. So another big accounting fraud where investors were being told one thing and what was actually going on was completely different. And these are just two examples, but there were a lot of other accounting frauds that occurred around the same time. And with all these frauds, they can be tied to an internal control failure. Okay, so some internal control failure. So, because of some internal control failure, these frauds were allowed to perpetuate and got really big and got out of control and eventually brought down some of the biggest companies in the world. Now, because these accounting scandals had such devastating impacts on our economy, Congress actually got involved. And so in 2002, Congress passed the Sarbanes and Oxley Act of 2002. And Sarbanes and Oxley Act is often referred to as SOX. And one of the things that SOX did is it required public companies to evaluate their internal controls and publish those findings with their SEC filings. So before SOX, companies would report their financials to investors, but now after SOX, they not only have to report their financials, but they have to provide some evaluation of the internal controls within the company so that the investors have an idea of whether or not the information that they're getting is reliable.
So this is an important part of SOX. If you know anything about SOX, one of the most important parts about it is the management is responsible. So management, like the CFO and the CEO, they just can't turn around and say, it happened down below. I didn't do it. I didn't know about it because that's not going to work. You're going to have problems if that's the kind of game you're playing. And if the SEC or the authorities can prove that you should have known, you're going to have a criminal problem. So nobody wants that, right? So that's what Sox really brought to the table, that the people running the firm just cannot blame, um, something like, hey, the accountants were on another building or on another floor, and I didn't know that that was happening, and I would have never gone along with it. And they don't want to hear that. And I think that goes a long way to keeping things clear, at least.
Because in the case of Enron and WorldCom, investors were getting financial information, but the information was wrong. It wasn't reliable. So now, after SOX, managers not only have to report the financial information, but they have to provide an assessment of the internal controls, how effective their internal controls actually are. And when we say internal control, this actually encompasses several things. So, internal control is the process designed to ensure reliable financial reporting. So, to ensure what we're telling investors is what's actually happening, to ensure effective and efficient operations so that things are running efficiently within the company, compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So, to make sure that the company is actually following the laws and regulations that they're supposed to, and to safeguard assets against theft, unauthorized use, acquisition, or disposal. So to make sure that the assets are actually safe, that the company is actually protecting the investor's assets. Internal controls cover all of these things. There are policies that are used to do all of these four things. Ensure reliable financial reporting, effective and efficient operations, compliance with laws and regulations, and to safeguard assets. So you can have controls to do all four of these things, and management must evaluate these controls. So, how does management do this? Well, the section of the Sarbanes Oxley Act that deals with internal controls is Section 404, and it requires a statement of management's responsibility for establishing and maintaining adequate internal
So that's exactly what I'm talking about. That section is basically ensuring that the management has verified this stuff.
controls over financial reporting. So we have to make sure that we have adequate controls to ensure that what we tell investors is actually what's going on. And it's just for public companies. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, one of the things that it includes is an assessment of the controls and the identification of the framework used for the assessment. Okay, so this is not an easy process. You think about it. how do you actually tell investors whether or not you have adequate controls? Well, you need some framework to evaluate this by. So you need to come up with some framework that allows you to assess your controls and how effectively they're working and report that information to investors. Now, the framework that's become kind of the standard for assessing a company's internal controls was established by the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, and it's referred to as COSO, and it was established in 1992. And this is the framework that has become the standard.
So for the work you're going to do, the homework, of course, this is a class that kind of explains accounting, but you want to know those acronyms. You're going to want to know who created it. I'm sure that you're going to be asked that question. And at least this way, if you get a job in compliance, or you even don't have to have a job in compliance, just that you will be subject to compliance, you know where the laws are coming from.
For assessing internal controls. So most companies use this COSO framework to assess their controls. And then they report that assessment to investors. And so that the investors have an idea of the effectiveness of the internal controls within the company. So if we look at the COSO framework, let's just take a quick moment and look at the COSO framework. You can see that it includes 5 interrelated components. Okay, and these are the things that management must assess. One, they must assess the control environment, the integrity and ethical values of the company, including its code of conduct, its involvement of the board of directors, and other actions that set the tone of the organization. And an important part of this assessment is how involved is the board of directors in ensuring that the overall tone of the organization is one that is ethical. Okay, remember the board of directors oversee the whole company. And if we think back to Enron, the tone of Enron was not one of being ethical. It was a tone of we must do anything we can to increase the stock price. The stock price must increase at all cost.
Now, to be fair, the Enron debacle happened at the highest levels of management. So, Enron was a big company. And unfortunately, as I said again, when there's malfeasance, every employee is affected, and plenty of them. And I would be positive that the majority of the employees, since it was such a big company, had nothing to do with the fraud, but they paid the price. Reputation. Well, one would be that you lose money or you had stock in the company. Another would be that, you don't want to see that on your resume. People would automatically assume negativity, even if you had zero to do with the fraud. It doesn't really, it's not something that's a positive.
And that tone was pushed down to all employees. So that's not the kind of tone.
And the key word this week is integrity. The key word this week is integrity.
That you want within an organization. And the next component is risk assessment. Management must have a process of identifying what risk could result in misstated financial statements and developing actions to address those risks. So risk assessment is an important component. Management needs to be forward thinking and identify potential risks before they actually become a problem environment. Are there controls within it? And we'll look at some actual internal controls in a second, but management needs to assess whether the control activities or the internal controls that are in place, whether those are sufficient and working effectively. The fourth component deals with information and communication.
I'm just going to reload this and fast forward, only because sometimes when you stop to talk, that
All
weird,
right, in this video, I want to talk about
that
internal
weird, that
controls.
weird thing
And internal
happens.
includes assessment of the technology environment. Now, in 2004, COSO updated the framework to help entities design and implement effective enterprise-wide approaches to risk management. And the updated document is titled Enterprise Risk Management. It's also referred to as ERM, an integrated framework. So ERM, or Enterprise Risk Management, is similar to risk assessment, except that ERM looks at the company as a whole, or the enterprise as a whole. So it's not just looking at individual risk. It's trying to assess the company's overall risk exposure. And is that risk exposure appropriate? So that's what ERM does. It's more of an enterprise-wide risk assessment. And so these 5 components plus ERM provide a framework for assessing internal controls. Now, if we want to look at a few examples of internal controls, so some common internal control practices are one, separating duties. So you have more than one person involved in a task. If you separate duties, then it requires more than one person to commit fraud. People have to collude in order to commit fraud, and it's a lot less likely that a fraud will occur if collusion is required. Another thing you can do is hire quality employees. It's often cheaper to pay more for an employee that's actually efficient and effective at doing their job than it is to pay less for an employee who does a bad job. So actually paying more to get quality employees is out of control. It results in employees that are more efficient and effective, and ultimately it can be cheaper in the long run. Another good control is to do things like background checks on your employees. Make sure that they are people of high integrity. And you can even bond them. You can get bonded employees. So you could buy a fidelity bond, which is essentially an insurance policy, which insures the company if the employee they hire happens to commit fraud or do something illegal. So you could bond your employees. That's another control you can have. You can require absences, make people go on vacation occasionally. If someone is perpetuating a fraud, they have to be there to continue to perpetuate it. So by forcing them to go on vacation provides an opportunity to discover the fraud. Okay, having a procedures manual.
These are all really good points. Bonding is great. Quality is a real important thing. Making people take time off. If you see somebody who's always in the office and never wants to leave, maybe they're just a hard worker. But you always have to wonder, why? What's the problem? Why don't they want to go out? Why don't they want to take some time off? We know we all like to take time off. It's a potential red flag. Not totally, but potential.
It is important to have a manual of what is expected of employees. Otherwise, people can rationalize different actions because they can say there's no rule against this. So, having a procedures manual that lays out the procedures that should be followed is an important internal control. Okay, authority and responsibility. If you give your employees the authority to use their own judgment and make their own decisions, they're generally going to work harder. And also, if they're held responsible for their actions, they're going to be more careful in the decisions they make. So the act of giving employees authority is a control, and holding those employees responsible for their actions is another control. These are different internal controls. And a company should have an authority manual that basically lists out the authority that each employee has and the chain of command or the chain of authority within an organization. Okay, pre-numbered documents. It's a lot easier to identify a missing document if they're numbered. If you have a checkbook and all the checks are numbered, it's really easy to figure out which check is missing. So pre-numbering documents is a good internal control to help identify missing documents. And then physical controls, these are kind of obvious, like locks, fireproof safes, things that can safeguard the company's assets. Those would be considered internal controls as well. And then finally, performing evaluations. You have to evaluate your own internal controls, and it's hard to do your own evaluation. So internal and external auditors are useful in evaluating a company's internal controls. So having evaluations of the effectiveness of controls, it's good to have those done by an outside party. And then finally, there are many limitations to internal controls. No matter how many internal controls are in place, a fraud can still occur. Okay, internal controls cannot completely prevent fraud. Employees can always collude together and commit fraud. So internal controls help, but they can't guarantee that a fraud will not occur.
So you get the point. No matter how um, strict you are, no matter how tight we are in terms of keeping an idea.